It was a bitterly cold December evening in Chicago, the kind that made every breath feel like shards of ice cutting into your lungs, and Emily Carter sat on the edge of a weathered park bench, her fingers trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of a day that had taken everything out of her. The city around her was alive with holiday cheer, storefronts dressed in gold ribbons, street musicians playing soft jazz under strings of fairy lights, couples holding hands with steaming cups of cocoa, but for Emily, all of it felt like a world she could see yet never touch. She had been jobless for 3 months now, ever since the small independent bookstore where she worked had shut its doors, leaving her with a box of her belongings, a final paycheck that barely covered 2 weeks' expenses, and a hollow ache in her chest. At first, she had believed she could turn things around quickly. Chicago was full of opportunities, right? But week after week of sending out resumes, dressing up for interviews that led to polite rejections, and watching her savings shrink to nothing had worn her down. Rent was overdue, her phone service had been cut off, and her fridge now held nothing but a half carton of milk and an apple that had gone soft. This morning had been her last gamble. She had scraped together the last of her cash to buy a bus ticket across the city for a job interview at a publishing company she had dreamed of working for since college. She had even borrowed a blazer from her neighbor, ironing it carefully, telling herself, this could be it, this could be the break. But when she arrived, breathless from the winter wind and full of nervous hope, the receptionist gave her an apologetic smile and explained the position had already been filled that morning. No explanation for why they hadn't called her to save her the trip. No hint of sympathy beyond a rehearsed tone. Emily had managed to say, "Thank you for your time," before walking back out into the biting wind, her pride forcing her to hold her head high until she turned the corner, then her shoulders slumped under the weight of yet another door slammed in her face. That's how she ended up here, sitting on a park bench just a few blocks from Michigan Avenue, staring at the festive lights until they blurred from tears she refused to let fall. Pride was a strange thing. It kept her from calling her estranged sister in Ohio, even though she knew her sister would help in a heartbeat. But old wounds from family arguments had never healed, and asking for help now felt like reopening them. "You'll be fine," she told herself, though the lump in her throat and the ache in her chest whispered otherwise. The air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, and her stomach clenched, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. She wrapped her thin coat tighter, but the cold still seeped in, gnawing at her bones. She was so deep in thought she didn't notice the man until he spoke. "Cold night," came a low, warm voice to her left, and she startled, turning to see a man in his late 50s sitting on the other end of the bench. His face was weathered, the kind of face that had clearly known both hardship and laughter, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His navy peacoat looked old but well kept, and a scarf with frayed edges was wrapped loosely around his neck. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, the kind that made you feel as if he was truly looking at you, not through you. She managed a small nod, not trusting her voice. For a few beats, they sat in silence, the only sound the crunch of footsteps on snow as people hurried past. Then he asked, almost casually, "Rough day?" Something in his tone, gentle, unassuming, slipped past her defenses, and before she knew it, she was telling him everything. About losing her job, about scraping by, about the wasted bus fare and the interview that wasn't. The words poured out of her in a rush, faster than she could filter them, as though they'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to catch them. He didn't interrupt once, didn't glance at his phone or look away. He just listened, leaning slightly forward, his expression calm but attentive. When she finally trailed off, cheeks flushed from both the cold and the embarrassment of oversharing, she mumbled, "Sorry, I don't usually unload like that on strangers." He shook his head gently. "Don't apologize," he said, and there was no pity in his voice, only understanding. "Sometimes we just need someone to hear us. No fixing. No judging. Just hearing." Then, without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brown envelope. He set it on the bench between them. "This isn't much," he said, "but I think you need it more than I do right now." Emily stared at it, her first instinct to protest rising like a reflex. "I can't take your money," she said quickly, but he shook his head with that same quiet smile. "You can, and you will. Because once upon a time, someone did the same for me, and I promised myself I'd pass it on when I could." She opened her mouth to argue again, but he had already stood up. "Merry Christmas, Emily," he said softly, and she blinked. How had he known her name? But before she could ask, he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd of bundled-up shoppers and glowing lights. Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were several crisp $50 bills. She let out a shaky breath, and this time the tears came freely, warm against her frozen cheeks. She wanted to run after him, to at least thank him, but he was gone, as though the city itself had swallowed him whole. That night, with the money he'd given her, she bought a hot meal, the first in days. A bag of groceries to last the week, and a bus ticket for another interview she had almost talked herself out of attending because it was 2 towns over and she didn't have the fare. Something about his gesture had rekindled a spark she thought had burned out. When she walked into that second interview, she was still wearing the same borrowed blazer, but her shoulders were back, her voice steady, her smile genuine. She got the job, nothing glamorous, just a receptionist position at a small community center, but it paid enough to cover rent and groceries, and more importantly, it surrounded her with people who cared about people. Over time, she began volunteering after hours, helping with literacy programs for underprivileged kids. She saw herself in some of those kids, the ones who sat in the back, quiet, unsure, afraid to hope for more. She learned their names, remembered their birthdays, celebrated their wins. Months later, one rainy Tuesday evening, as she was stacking chairs after a class, a young mother approached her, eyes red from crying. I just lost my part-time job," the woman stammered, "and I don't know how I'm going to feed my 2 kids until my next paycheck." Emily didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small brown envelope, not with money she couldn't spare, but with cash she had deliberately set aside each month for exactly this reason. She pressed it into the woman's hand, saying, "Someone once did the same for me. Pass it on, when you can." The woman's lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." Years passed, and Emily's life grew in ways she couldn't have imagined on that cold December night. She eventually started a non-profit to help women in crisis find jobs and housing. It wasn't easy, there were grants to apply for, budgets to stretch, endless meetings, but every time she felt overwhelmed, she remembered the man in the navy peacoat. She never saw him again, though every Christmas Eve, she returned to that same bench, sitting for a while, watching the lights blur in the falling snow. Sometimes, she swore she saw him in the crowd, just a glimpse, a shape, a smile, and in those moments, she hoped he knew, his kindness had never stopped with her. It had rippled outward, touching hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, transforming tears into hope.